A thug mocked the Royal Guard's medals, laughing at his service for all to hear. But the moment he reached for them, one move from the guard made the entire crowd freeze. Here's what happened now. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from the comments. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at this very same time, we're dropping another powerful Royal Guard story that you won't want to miss. The summer sun beat down on Buckingham Palace, where tourists gathered to photograph the iconic scarlet uniform. Guard Sergeant Craig Wilson stood at attention, his Distinguished Service Cross and campaign medals gleaming against his tunic. Honors earned through combat, not ceremony. 8 years of military service had taught him to stand unmoved through all conditions. Today would test that training. Look at this bloke. A harsh voice cut through the crowd, dressed up like a toy soldier. Darren Mitchell, muscular, with shaved head, shouldered through the tourist 5 pints at a nearby pub, had fueled his resentment toward authority. Nice hat, he called mockingly. Does it come with matching handbag? His 3 companions snigger behind him. Wilson's eyes remained fixed ahead, cataloging the threat without showing response. Look at these stupid medals, Darren continued. Costume jewelry from the gift shop. A couple quickly moved their children away. Others shifted uncomfortably. I bet he's never seen a day of real action, Darren announced loudly, just standing here pretending to be important. Wilson's mind flashed to the ambush outside Canar, but his face revealed nothing. Those medals, Darren pointed his finger invasively close to Wilson's chest. What are they supposed to be for best dressed at the palace costume party? His friends laughed on cue, though one of them glanced around nervously, beginning to sense that they were crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. A group of American tourists had stopped to watch their expressions, a mixture of discomfort and fascination. One of them, a balding man in his 60s, frowned deeply and turned to his wife. That guy's got no idea what those medals mean. He muttered, my dad had a Distinguished Service Cross from Korea. You don't get those for standing NG around. I read that these guards are actual soldiers. His wife replied, her voice carrying just enough of those nearby to hear active military personnel with real combat experience. Darren caught the comment and swiveled toward them, his face flushing darker. Active, the only thing active about this one is his imagination. Love, these are just ceremonial jobs for lads who couldn't cut it in real service. He turned back to Wilson, emboldened by the audience and his friend's encouragement. Isn't that right, mate? Those medals as fake as that furry hat. But you bought the whole set in the gift shop. He gestured toward the palace gift shop, where tourists were browsing postcards and replica crowns. Wilson remained motionless, his discipline holding firm against a barrage behind the perfect ceremonial mask. He was cataloging exits, assessing the potential threat level, and calculating exactly how many more steps it would take before protocol would allow him to respond. His training had prepared him for ambushes of all kinds, including this one. I'll tell you what, Darren announced, raising his voice to address the gathering crowd. I bet 20 quid these medals are fake. Just props to the tourists. Anyone want to prove me wrong? The challenge hung in the air, met with uncomfortable silence and empty. An averted gaze as Darren's smile widened with misplaced triumph, interpreting the lack of response as victory rather than a collective judgment. It actually was what's the matter. Darren took another step closer, now well within the invisible boundary that respectful tourists instinctively maintained. Cat, got your tongue, soldier boy. Or should I say, actor boy. His breath was hot and sour against Wilson's face, but the guard's expression remained fixed, his eyes focused on the same distant point they had held for the past 2 hours of his duty. Look at this one here. Darren's finger jabbed toward the Distinguished Service Cross gleaming on Wilson's chest. What's this supposed to be for bravest man at the tea party? He turned to his friends, playing to his audience. Betty gets a medal every time he manages not to blink. One of Darren's companions pulled out his phone and began filming. This is going to be epic, he announced. Come on, Darren, see if you can make him crack. An elderly woman spoke up. Young man, that's quite enough. Have some respect for the uniform. Darren spun toward her, his face darkening. Respect for what's standing around like furniture? My tax money pays a salary. And what's he doing to earn it? Actually, a tall American tourist began. I read that these guards, or did I ask for a history lesson? Darren cut him off, taking a threatening step toward a man who quickly backed away. Satisfied, Darren turned back to the guard seat. Even your fans are cowards, just like your family with young children. Hurried away as the crowd thinned to those too curious to leave. Tell me something, soldier. Darren continued, shifting his weight from foot to foot. What do you actually have to do to get all those pretty little trinkets polished? The general's boots? Sir, the queen, her morning tea. Wilson's breathing remained steady. He had faced Taliban fighters. At close range, this drunken bully was nothing but a footnote in an otherwise routine day. Frustrated by the guard's composure, Darren launched into an exaggerated imitation. The guard stands back, rigid, chest puffed out. Look at me, he announced in a falsetto voice. I'm a big, brave soldier with my fancy hat and toy gun. I fought brave LY against dangerous tourists stood at attention. While old ladies took my picture very dangerous, work as friends roared with laughter, while the remaining tourists watched in uncomfortable silence, embarrassed, not for the guard, but for the man mocking him I earned. This medal Darren continued his performance, pinning an imaginary decoration to his chest for exceptional bravery in the face of a Japanese tour group. And this one he added another invisible badge for surviving a dangerous attack by a squirrel in the palace gardens. He spun back to face the guard, dropping the act as quickly as he'd adopted it. That's all you lot are good for in playing dress-up for the cameras. While real men do real work, the guard's eyes hadn't moved, but something had changed in the quality of his stillness. It was no longer just ceremonial discipline. It was a coiled readiness of a calm combat veteran, assessing a potential threat. The tourists closest to Wilson seemed to sense the shift, taking instinctive steps backward, as if making room for whatever might come next. Those medals, Darren jabbed a finger toward the guard's chest. What are they really for? This one here looks fancy. His finger hovered inches from the Distinguished Service Cross, probably given out for haircut in the regiment. Yeah, a few tourists shook their heads and walked away, unable to bear the discomfort of witnessing such blatant disrespect. Others remained, rooted in place, sensing that they were witnessing something that would reach a memorable conclusion. I'll tell you what these medals are, Darren announced, rocking back on his heels. They're distractions, something shiny, to make you all forget that this is just a bloke in a costume doing the job a mannequin could do better. He turned his friend, spreading his arms wide. Am I right? Or am I right? Who here thinks these medals actually mean anything? He swept his arm to indicate the remaining tourists, most of whom looked away, unwilling to engage. Emboldened by the lack of contradiction, Darren pressed on. See, no one believes that it's all just theater and the monarchy, the guard, the whole dog and pony show, just to get you lot apart with your money at the jiff chop. He leaned in closer to the guard, his voice dropping to a mock whisper that still carried everyone nearby. How's it feel, mate, standing here day after day, pretending to be something you're not? Must be hard, keeping up the act. All those fake medals weighing you down. Wilson's eyes remained fixed, but behind them was a memory of carrying a wounded comrade across 50 mers of open ground under heavy fire, action that had earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, that this drunken fool was now mocking. 6 months of recovery from his own wounds had followed, then a return to active duty, because that's what soldiers that they carried on. I've got a theory, Darren announced, turning back to his dwindling audience with the air of a professor about to deliver a groundbreaking lecture. These medals are like those plastic toys they put in Christmas crackers, just cheap bits of tin. Anyone could get, probably not even military decorations. He circled the guard like a shark, looking for a reaction. Any crack in the perfect facade. What's your game, soldier boy? How much do they pay you to stand here like an idiot while we all laugh at you? Darren's friends had grown quieter, one of them checking his watch and muttering something about getting back. The mood was shifting as Darren's performance became increasingly desperate, his need for reaction driving him toward a dangerous edge. I'll bet 50 quid, Darren suddenly announced, waving a crumpled note, that I can prove these medals are fake. When no one responded, he grinned. Then I'll just have to prove it myself. The atmosphere crystallized with tension. Darren's challenge wasn't just words anymore, but a prelude to action. Come on, Darren. Maybe that enough, said his friend, with the neck tattoo lowering his phone. I'm just getting started, Darren replied, his pride fully invested. Time to expose the shared. He turned back to the guard, whose perfect stillness had taken on a different quality. Those with military experience might have recognized it, not the posed stillness of ceremony, but the controlled readiness of a soldier assessing a threat. These medals, Darren continued, his voice carrying the false confidence of someone committed to a terrible decision. I bet they're not even attached properly, just pinned on for show. He brushed his fingers through his short hair, a nervous tell betraying the bravado in his voice. Let's have a closer look, shall we? The crowd collectively held its breath. A woman with professional camera lowered it slowly, unwilling to document what might happen next. A father pulled his son closer to his side, using his body as a shield while remaining rooted in place, unable to tear himself away from the unfolding drama. I'm just going to inspect the merchandise, Darren announced, taking another step forward. If they're real, no harm done, right? And if they're fake, his lips curled into a smirk, then we all learned something valuable about our taxpayer money. The Distinguished Service Cross caught the sunlight as Darren moved close to the metal surface, reflecting a brief golden flash. In that same moment, Sergeant Wilson mind flashback to the day he'd earned it, not in ceremony, but in blood and fire. The memory flashed vividly, the scorching Afghan sun, the sudden crack of gunfire, the Ambush that had separated his unit Corporal Jenkins, taking a bullet to the thigh, arterial blood pulsing between Wilson's fingers. The decision to break cover, dragging Jenkins across 50 m of exposed ground as bullets kicked up dust around them. The searing pain as a round grazed his own shoulder. The final desperate sprint to the extraction point, mind focused on a single thought, not leaving anyone behind. The medal Darren now reached for had been presented after Wilson recovered from his wounds for conspicuous gallantry during operations in Afghanistan. The citation had read, Sergeant Wilson's actions under direct enemy fire saved the life of Corporal Jenkins and displayed courage of the highest order. That medal wasn't just metal and ribbon. It carried the weight of brotherhood, sacrifice, and duty. Let's see what we've got here, Darren said, his hand extending toward Wilson's chest, his fingers stained yellow from cigarettes. Hovered just inches from the distinguished service cross, probably. Comes right off. Doesn't time seem to slow as Darren's hand moved those final few inches around them? Several tourists took unconscious steps backward, sensing the invisible boundary being violated. One of Darren's friends muttered, Jesus, mate, and turned away, unwilling to watch what might happen next. Wilson's mind calculated distances, angles, appropriate levels of force, all while maintaining a ceremonial pose. 8 years of military discipline, W, with a protective instinct that viewed those medals as sacred symbols, not just of his service, but of all who had served alongside him, of those who hadn't come home at all. Darren's fingertips made contact with the polished surface of the distinguished service. Crossed the medal was cool despite the summer heat, the ribbon stiff with starch and tradition. His lips curled into a triumphant smile as he prepared to tug at the medal to prove his point about cheap props and meaningless ceremony. It was at that precise moment that Sergeant Craig Wilson broke protocol. The movement was so sudden, so precisely executed, that many in the crowd would later struggle to describe exactly what they'd seen. One moment the guard stood in ceremonial stillness. The next, his white-gloved hand had captured Darren's wrist in a grip that combined military precision with combat-trained strength. Darren's triumphant expression collapsed into shock as his arm was immobilized, in midair air, caught like a butterfly in a vice. The guard's eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance throughout the entire confrontation, now locked directly onto Darren with an intensity that made the man physically recoil. Remove your hand. Each word fell like a hammer blow delivered in a commanding tone that had directed men in combat, that had cut through the chaos of battlefield communications with unquestionable authority. The crowd gasped collectively, not just at the broken silence, but at the sudden transformation. Gone was the ceremonial statue. In its place stood a warrior whose bearing radiated the quiet authority of someone who had faced real threats and survived. The contrast between Wilson's controlled precision and Darren's sudden stammering confusio couldn't have been starker. I was just Darren, began his bravado, evaporating like morning dew under the desert sun. You were just attempting to touch decorations awarded for combat valor. Wilson interrupted, his voice a debt, but carrying an edge that could cut steel decorations earned in blood and fire, not given as prizes or purchased as souvenirs. The guard's grip remained precisely calibrated, firm enough to control, not so tight as to bruise. It was a hold of someone who knew exactly how much force to apply, who had been trained and neutralized threats with minimum damage, someone whose self-control was not a weakness, as Darren had assumed, but his greatest strength. These medals represent sacrifice you cannot comprehend. Wilson continued, each word measured and deliberate. They are symbols of duty carried out under conditions you have never faced, and courage you have never been called upon to show. Darren's friends had backed away there. Earlier encouragement replaced by the sudden realization that they had pushed their luck too far. The friend of the phone had stopped filming, his hand dropping to his side, as if the device had suddenly become too heavy to hold. I didn't mean. Darren tried again, his voice several octaves higher than its earlier mocking tone. You did mean. Wilson cut him off. You meant to disrespect not just me, but every man and woman who has put on this uniform, who has stood on battlefields you only see in movies, who has carried wounded comrades through gunfire, who has attended the funerals of brothers and sisters, who gave everything in service. The silence around them was absolute now. Even the distant traffic seemed to have paused, as if London itself was holding its breath to witness this moment of reckoning. The sunlight caught the medals on Wilson's chest, transforming them from objects of mockery to what they truly were, tests of valor, to sacrifice to duty fulfilled at terrible cost. Darren's wrist remained caught in the guard's unyielding grip, his arm suspended in the moment of his greatest miscalculation. His face had drained of color, the earlier alcohol-induced bravado replaced by the dawning realization that he had not been taunting a ceremonial figure, but challenging a decorated combat veteran whose restraint had been an act of discipline, not weakness. Those medals, Wilson's voice penetrated the silence, are not for show. They are reminders of choices made. Under fire, comrades' loss of promises kept when keeping them nearly cost. Everything this Wilson continued his free hand, rising to touch the distinguished service cross that Darren had attempted to grab, was awarded after an ambush outside Kandahar. My patrol was hit by Tal Allen fighters. Half my unit cut off. Corporal Jenkins took around to the femoral artery. His voice remained measured, educational, rather than emotional, yet somehow all the more powerful for its restraint. I had a choice: stay in cover or cross 50 m of open ground. Under direct fire, the medal says I chose correctly. His eyes never left Darren's face, which had transitioned from shock to uncomfortable understanding. Jenkins has a daughter he's able to watch grow up. Because of that choice, I have a scar from the round that found me during the extraction. Wilson's grip remained steady this campaign. Medal represents 18 months in Afghanistan. 3 friends who never came home nights under mort fire days in 50-degree heat, in full gear carrying wounded children to safety. Darren had stopped struggling, his bravado replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. Around them, tourists stood in perfect stillness, many with tears gathering in their eyes as Ribbon acknowledges service in Iraq. Roadside bombs, snipers delivering medical supplies, the civilians caught in crossfire. Wilson's voice carried no self-pity, just a matter OFA delivery of a soldier reporting facts. 2 weeks after this photo was taken, he nodded toward the portrait pinned inside his uniform. Half the men in it were wounded. In a coordinated attack, 3 didn't survive. He released Darren's wrist with a deliberate movement as precise as everything else about him. Darren stumbled back a step, rubbing his wrist, not because the hold had been painful, but because the sudden absence of that controlled strength left him unbalanced. You mock what you don't understand. Wilson continued his posture, still perfect despite having broken ceremonial stance. You see a man standing guard and assume that's all he's ever done. That's all he's capable of doing. He gestured toward his uniform with a slight movement of his gloved hand. The ceremonial duty is not a performance. It's a continuation of service, a reminder that the values these gates represent, duty, honor, sacrifice, aren't just words on a recruitment poster. They're actions, choices made when choices matter most. 2 palace security officers had appeared at the edges of the scene, alerted by tourists who had slipped away during the confrontation. They approached cautiously, sensing that they were witnessing something that required delicate handling. A police constable had joined them, his radio quietly reporting the situation to headquarters. Do you know what these medals really represent, Sir? Wilson asked, addressing ING Darren with the formal sir that somehow carried more weight than any insult could have. They represent moments when it would have been easier to do nothing, safer to do nothing. When self-preservation argued against duty, his eyes locked with Darren's, searching for some sign of comprehension. They're reminders that sometimes the right choice is the hardest one. Darren's friends had backed away completely, now try and fade into the crowd to disassociate themselves from what had happened. One had actually turned and walked briskly toward the nearest exit, abandoning his companion to whatever consequences might follow. I don't, Darren began, his voice barely audible. I didn't realize. No, Wilson agreed. You didn't. You saw a uniform and assumed it was a costume. You saw medals and assumed they were props. You saw discipline and mistook it for weakness. His voice remained level, neither accusatory nor angry, simply stating facts with the directness of a man accustomed to clarity. Under pressure, security officers flanked Darren, while the police constable stepped forward, notebook in hand. Sir, I'll need to take your details, he said to Darren, whose face had taken on a sickly pallor. You attempted to interfere with a Queen's Guard while on active duty. The constable continued. There's also the matter of attempted theft of military decorations, which falls under the Uniform Crimes Act. I wasn't trying to steal anything, Darren protested weakly. I was just your hand on his medal. Suggests otherwise. The constable interrupted. We have multiple witnesses and video evidence. An elderly man spoke up. He definitely tried to grab the medal, said he was going to prove it was fake. Disgraceful behavior, added a British woman, went on for quite some time before he actually touched anything. Sergeant Wilson had returned to his ceremonial stance, eyes once again fixed forward. A transformation was remarkable, from commanding presence back to ceremonial guard, yet somehow the stillness now communicated strength rather than the passive target. Darren had mistaken him for the attempted theft of military decorations. Carries a potential sentence of up to 6 months, the constable informed Darren, whose face had gone from pale to almost gray. The security officers moved in closer, one of them gesturing for Darren to accompany them. Sir, We'll need you to come with us while this matter is sorted out." Darren looked desperately toward his remaining friend, who suddenly became very interested in examining his shoes. Left without support, Darren's shoulders slumped in defeat. I wasn't thinking that much is evident," the constable agreed, not unkindly. He had dealt with tourist misbehavior before, but something about this incident felt different, more personal, perhaps because of his own father's military service. Unfortunately, actions have consequences regardless of intent. As Darren was being led away, he stopped suddenly and turned back toward Wilson. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward back in his ceremonial role, as if the confrontation had never happened. "I'm sorry," Darren said, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. "I was wrong about all of it." The words seemed to cost him something, each syllable dragged reluctantly from a place he rarely visited. Humility. Wilson gave no indication that he'd heard the apology. His disciplined stillness, once again complete, yet those closest to him might have noticed the slightest nod, nearly imperceptible. Asada's acknowledgement of words that needed to be said. The security team continued, leading Darren away, the constable following with his notebook. Still open, the crowd began to disperse, their excited chatter filling the courtyard as they processed what they'd witnessed. Parents pulled children close, using the moment as an impromptu teaching opportunity about respect and consequences. Tour guides who had arrived mid-incident were already incorporating the event into their narratives, voices rising and falling as they explained the significance of the guards and their decorations. One of the American tourists approached, cautiously maintaining a respectful distance from Wilson's position. "My father had a Distinguished Service Cross," he said quietly, though whether he expected a response was unclear. "From Korea, never talked about how he got it, but he always said the medal wasn't for him, it was for the men who didn't come back." The man nodded, once almost a military gesture, though he hadn't served himself, and moved away. An older British couple lingered nearby, the woman dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "My brother was Royal Marines," a husband said to his wife, just loudly enough to be overheard. "Always said people mistook silence for weakness, when really it was the strongest thing of all." As the courtyard returned to its normal rhythm of tours and photographs, something had changed in how the tourists approached Wilson's position. They maintained a more RSP respectful distance. Parents spoke in hushed educational tones to their children. Even the photographs seemed different, less about capturing a stoic figure in a ceremonial uniform, more about documenting a living symbol of service and sacrifice. The medals that had been the target of mockery now gleamed in the afternoon sun, their significance no longer hidden behind ceremony, but illuminated by the truth Wilson had spoken. Each passing tourist who glanced at them now saw not decorative trinkets, but symbols of choices made under fire duty, fulfilled at great cost of values that transcended the ceremonial role in which they were now displayed. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the palace grounds, Sergeant Wilson maintained his post with unwavering discipline. The Distinguished Service Cross caught the fading sunlight, its meaning now forcefully reclaimed. Tourists passed with a noticeable sense of respect. Parents explained to their children not just the ceremonial duty, but the deeper significance of the man before them, a soldier whose stillness represented the highest form of self-discipline. The incident had transformed how visitors viewed the guard, no longer just a photo opportunity, but a living embodiment of service and sacrifice. The medals Darren had mocked were now understood for what they truly were, symbols of courage under fire, choices made when choices mattered most. As the changing of the guard approached, Wilson prepared to complete his duty with precision. The confrontation would become palace law, a reminder that behind every ceremonial uniform stood a person who had earned the right to wear it through real service. "What do you think about the guard's response? Was breaking protocol justified to protect the symbols of sacrifice he'd earned? And how might you react if you witnessed someone disrespecting military decorations or the people who earned them? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated with our latest uploads. Check out our other videos appearing on your screen now for more powerful stories of respect and tradition. Remember, true strength lies not in mockery, but in understanding the sacrifices of those who serve.